Before I hand over to our official moderator of today's session, I will just quickly go over some housekeeping and accessibility tips. We do have simultaneous language interpretation available today for Bahasa Indonesia, Bislama, Nepali, Vietnamese, and Tetun. To turn on the simultaneous interpretation, click on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen and select your required language. We also have International Sign and Auslan interpretation available. We are spotlighting the interpreters and you should be able to see them on your screen. Please let us know in the chat box if you are having trouble seeing or pinning the interpreters. We also have English live captioning, which you can turn on using the CC button in your Zoom screen. Okay, I would also like to request everyone to keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking, and we will make sure to speak one at a time, speak slowly and clearly, and for our speakers, when you do unmute to come to speak, please do say your name at the beginning. We are requesting that participants leave your cameras off to be focusing and making sure it's focused on our International Sign and Auslan videos, which have been spotlighted. During today's session, if you have any challenges with a technology and need assistance, please direct message Laura in the chat box. Tech support Laura. Please also note today that today's webinar will include speakers sharing their experiences of barriers, exclusion, discrimination, stigma, and disaster events. If you think participating in this webinar might raise any concerns for you, there is no problem if you want to step away or disconnect at any time. We are so pleased that this webinar is being attended by participants from across Asia and the Pacific. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are calling in from today. In my case, here in Melbourne, Australia, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respect to elders past and present. I would like to further acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where people are in this webinar are coming from, their connections to land, sea, and community. If you would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where you are today, please take a moment to do that in the chat box. But with all that housekeeping out of the way, it is now my pleasure to introduce our webinar facilitator, Mr. Setareki Mekanawai, who is the CEO of the Pacific Disability Forum and one of the steering committee members for this consultation project. Over to you now, Seta.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome colleagues, friends, and I want to welcome everybody that have joined from Asia Pacific region and maybe beyond to this webinar on the topic of disabilities, persons with disabilities and disasters. This webinar aims to share the findings of the consultation process that was conducted by the Pacific Disability Forum, the International Disability Alliance, and CBM Inclusion Advisory Group. The consultation process gathered the perspective of persons with disabilities across the Asia and the Pacific region on disaster and disaster risk reduction. Let me tell you a little bit more about this session and how it will go. We will be starting with a keynote address from Ms. Caitlin Wilson from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We will then be taking a quick look at some of the key findings from this consultation. We'll also be hearing from some guest speakers who are involved in this consultation. And of course, before we close, we will have some questions and answers. Now, I would like to welcome on all our behalf Ms. Caitlin Wilson, who is the Assistant Secretary, Humanitarian and Refugee Branch of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Prior to joining the Humanitarian Trade and Refugee Branch, Caitlin was a Deputy Commissioner for Australia to Papua New Guinea, 2018-2021. And the Deputy Head of Mission and Deputy Representative, Australian Mission to the United Nations in New York, 2015-2017. We are so pleased to have Caitlin with us today. And now I welcome her to give us the keynote address. Caitlin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Setareki. Can I just get a thumbs up if you can hear me? I think so from the interpreter. Great, thank you. I just wanted to start by thanking CBM, to our moderator, and all of the participants, including our interpreters, for the opportunity to provide an address today. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Indigenous people participating here today. As you all know, disability inclusion is a high priority for the Australian government, and an aspect that Australia has promoted in the Pacific and in international fora, including in the United Nations. There are a number of reasons for this. According to the World Health Organization, 15% of the world's population has a disability. This translates to an estimated 690 million people with disabilities living in our Asia-Pacific region. People with a disability are disproportionately affected by disasters and in humanitarian crises, but also frequently excluded from decision-making, whether before, during, or after disasters. As we will hear today, disaster preparedness information is often not available in accessible formats, so people with disabilities are less aware and prepared in advance of a disaster. In Vanuatu, following Tropical Cyclone Pam, for example, research found that 60% of persons with disabilities reported a lack of information on what to do before the cyclone. And in South Asia, in relation to COVID-19, people with disabilities report receiving insufficient health information to protect themselves and families. People with disabilities are more likely to be left behind, injured, and even killed during a disaster or emergency. When a disaster or humanitarian crisis occurs, people with disabilities face additional barriers to flee or to evacuate safely with the rest of the community. And even if able to leave their houses, they may not be able to reach shelter because of long distances or difficult terrain. If they reach the evacuation centre, they may not be able to enter because of stairs or other barriers. And they may face additional challenges throughout this process due to a combination of discrimination and social stigma. I know that we will hear more today, both on the challenges, but also a number of strengths which people with disabilities bring. And some of those that we have already highlighted and would like to hear more about include the unique knowledge and experience essential to the survival and the resilience of your communities as a whole. You have capacities and resources to contribute to humanitarian action, to build sustainable resilience for all. We must harness these capabilities and ensure all voices are heard. And this is why people with disabilities, as well as women and girls, young people, the elderly, Indigenous peoples, and other marginalised groups are included in decision-making on risk-informed development and disaster risk reduction where possible. We see this as essential. We know in practice this is challenging and there are many sensitivities to navigate. I would like to thank all of you and others who participated in consultations, sharing knowledge and experience. Thanks also to colleagues at CBM, to the Pacific Disability Forum, and also the International Disability Alliance for this important study, which clearly identifies the needs and gaps in disaster risk reduction, and also helps us to understand the changes needed to ensure that no one is left behind. This discussion is very timely. 2022 is a year of opportunity to advance disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. It builds on the recent Global Disability Summit and this year's Commission on the Status of Women. And we look forward to many upcoming opportunities to share knowledge and real experience, including the May Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in Indonesia, through providing analysis over the year to inform the high-level meeting on the midterm review of the Sendai framework in May 2023, and also at the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in September this year, which Australia is hosting in Brisbane. Australia has made a number of commitments during the Global Disability Summit, which we believe will help advance disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. So again, I look forward to hearing further on these types of initiatives. Also, as co-host of the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, Australia is ensuring a strong focus on disability inclusion and ensuring people with disabilities can participate and have a voice. With the Asia Pacific, the most disaster-prone region in the world, this conference will provide a very important opportunity to review risk reduction efforts, share and learn about innovative and practical solutions, and for countries and organisations to make actionable commitments. Our Pacific neighbours and family, with resilience developed over generations of experience and much exposure to natural hazards, will join us. We look forward to providing more opportunities to hear your voices and experiences and to share solutions. Today is an important opportunity to hear more from you. Thank you to the CBM team for organising the webinar today. I'd now like to pass back to our moderator, Seta Reki, with many thanks.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, for your excellent keynote address and the reassurance and the sharing of the Government of Australia's leadership around disability inclusion in disaster risk reduction. As Caitlin mentioned, and as we've heard, the Government of Australia, through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, commissioned this consultation process to understand the experience of persons with disabilities in relation to disaster preparedness. Today, we would like to provide some feedback on some of the key findings from this consultation. We noted that over 600 people with disabilities from our region, Asia and the Pacific, participated in the survey, focus group discussions, interviews, sharing the experiences on disaster and disaster risk reduction. Through this process, we heard from people with disabilities about their perspectives, experiences, and priorities in relation to DRR, disaster risk reduction. In addition to the global COVID-19 pandemic that we all know, people with disabilities in our Asia Pacific region has experienced various disasters. The Asian Pacific region has the highest rate of natural hazard events in the world, as we also heard from Caitlin. And from the survey, the most common disasters people reported experiencing include floods, earthquakes, air pollution, heat waves, and tropical cyclones or typhoons. Furthermore, the findings show that over 90% of respondents have personally experienced such disasters in the previous 3 years. And 96.4% believed that they are themselves at risk for future disasters. Our next point, less than half of the survey respondents had previously participated in DRR, in DRR activities. Most people reported that the lack of accessibility had prevented them from participating. This includes the lack of access to information, communication support, and reasonable accommodation. A significant number of persons with disabilities also report that they were not invited to participate. In terms of evacuation during disaster, another area that was explored in this consultation was seeking safety and evacuating in the event of disaster. The majority, about 80% of survey respondents indicated that in the event of a disaster, they would have difficulty evacuating to a safer location. The reasons for this included that they need assistance, need extra time or warning, as well as being unable to evacuate at all. Many people with disabilities reported that evacuation centers are inaccessible and unsafe. Some reported experiencing discrimination from members in the community. Furthermore, the findings from the discussions and interviews indicated that women and girls with disabilities face additional risk of gender-based violence in evacuation centers. Now, having said that, we are now going to hear from a number of guest speakers who participated in this consultation process. A key aim of this work was to collect the voices and experience of people with disabilities in disaster risk reduction. We want to have their perspectives, the front and center of DRR, perspective of persons with disabilities, front and center of DRR, policy making and programming. Pleased to share that we have two of our speakers are joining us from countries in Asia, and two of our speakers are joining us from countries from the Pacific. After we hear from our speakers, we will have a question and answer session. So if you are listening, please feel free, take note of these questions or add these questions in the chat box provided. It is now my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Professor Asha Hans, the founder of Women Disabilities India. Professor Asha is a disability and gender activist, academic, and author. She's a former professor of political science and women's studies in the University of India, and was recently a member on the board of the UN Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. Welcome, Professor Asha, and I hand you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sita. It's good to be here today and to join all of you as part of the Asia Pacific discussion that we are holding. I will talk about the place where I live, and that is the eastern part of India, but also focus on women with disabilities with whom I work. The area that I live in has very high cyclones, at least 4 to 5 a year, very high extents and very the high magnitude. And because of that, and otherwise also, there is flooding and there is also drought. But recently there has been a very high amount of lightning, which has been killing people, including those with disabilities. We, I believe, learn from our experiences and our history. And for us, staying on the eastern coast of India, our history goes back to the 1999 cyclone, which had about 10,000 people were killed. The mortality and morbidity was very, very high. But though there were UN agencies, governments from across the world who had come to help, there was no funding for persons with disabilities. There was what we did through our own solidarity networks. So that is the only way that we could work. We also realized that we need to look at disability not as a homogeneous group, but look at the diversity, both in types of disability as well as gender and other, for example, LGBTQ, etc. We also found that in 1999, there was no legal resource. It was later that the CRPD and after the tsunami that India adopted a new law. But unfortunately, women were still not included. There was no capacity building at the grassroots level. Since then, things have moved further, and we are, at least in this region, one of the things that has happened is evacuation. Millions of people are evacuated, but persons of disability are still left behind, and no one seems to know how to evacuate them. Women with disability have patriarchy standards which they have to live with, and as a result, because of disasters linked to climate change, we have lost at least 60% of the agriculture where women work. And as women have very little land, there is very little that they can do. Water has reduced and bore wells have been set up, which is more linked to technology and market. So women have no control over it, which they had earlier. Health is still a problem in 2022 because sexual and reproductive health and gender-based violence is still not part of the law or of the SOPs that we have. What has changed is that skill building, women are now involved by some government programs which are where they have taken part, but still consultations are still, women are left out. COVID as a disaster has had tremendous impact on women with disabilities, especially with 95% women facing food insecurity as well as no access to health. There has been an invisible group where women with disabilities are concerned, and we have tried our best to see that they're brought into the consultations and decision-making processes, both in India, in Asia. We are thankful to UNFPA for helping us do this, but we realize that there can be no justice without the lived experiences of women with disabilities. Their voices need to be included in our conversation. They are still an invisible group at all places. I'll end with this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Asha. We will turn to our next speaker, and my apology, I forgot to mention that each speaker will be given 5 minutes, and I hope we can stick to that time. our second speaker from Asia, Janatal Ferdas. And do forgive me if I pronounced your name incorrectly. Sorry, let me just to say that Janatal is a human rights activist, writer, and the first woman with disability filmmaker in Bangladesh. She's also the founder of Voice and Views, a human rights organization to promote the rights of persons with disabilities. Over to you, Janatal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am just going through, not repeating the same information like Asha has explained. These are almost similar in Asian countries. I am starting from the experiences. Apart from the other disasters like landslides, cyclone, lightnings, and other floods over extreme rain, heat, along with all these things, I want to add another disaster like fire accidents, both in slum areas or accidents in buildings. Especially it is happening as explosion to our industrial chemical areas and in R&D sector, R&D buildings, which are the high-rise buildings. So fire accidents should be included in a disaster. And because behind the, I want to present a statistics that in 2013, Dhaka Medical College has registered their inpatient and outpatient numbers. Those became actually 8,119 victims were hospitalized and 3,501 outpatients were have taken the services. So in total, in only 1 year, by one government hospital, the number came 11,620 patients. So in all over the country, how many patients are being admitted, and they are becoming more personal disabilities because of fire accidents. So what happens during fire accidents, I experienced once in my life that I was in a for IELTS exam, but that building was announced all on a sudden about fire accident alarming. So I found that the stairs have become so crowded that even I couldn't find out the any place where I could go downstairs. All on a sudden, I just was thinking that what happens with my other colleagues who has disability of visual impairment and who are wheelchair users and more persons with more level of disability they have. So we really need the preparedness among skill development and regular practices, how to evacuate from fire accidents and other accidents among the persons with disabilities and of course with the communities. So this is my main focus as a burn accident survivor person in this world. So I wish to point out in this fire accident as a disaster management system. Others are almost similar experiences we have, that women are becoming more vulnerable during disasters. How to actually focus out that, point out that during the disasters, the relief distribution system, all other things like in Dhaka city, we have other regular disaster, waterlogging at urban area. So at that moment, persons who doesn't have disability, they are also locked in their home. What is happening with the persons with disabilities, that life becomes miserable, that we can understand. So the city corporation and other concerned corporations, other authorities, they have no knowledge or management system during rainy season to how to manage the disasters, and what about the inclusive disaster management. So all these things we actually need to do. And among all these organizations, we are actually taking it as
Janital, can you be summing up your point? We'll need to move on to the next speaker.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Janital. Sorry for having to stop you in your tracks, your passionate presentation. I hope there'll be a question and answer that'll come your way again to you can elaborate on what you wanted to share. Let's come to the Pacific now with our two speakers. Our third speaker is Rima Misa from Tonga. Is the pioneer of the disability movement in Tonga, and also started several OPDs in Tonga and the work there, and also part of the PDF resource team. Rima, the floor is yours, and malolele and welcome. Rima, if you are talking, can you check that you are unmuted?
Sorry, Sitter, it's Karen speaking. I've just had a message from Rima to say that he's having connection problems. So would it be possible to go to Teka first?
Yes, we'll go to our next speaker from Kiribati. Mr. Tekamangu. I would not want to even try his second name. He's the office manager for Te Tomato from Kiribati, leader in his own right. Teka, welcome. Kona Maori, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. And first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to share our work from the Kiribati on the OBD, the tornado, which is called the tornado. And as you know, Kiribati is one of our common issues that we are affected by the disaster is the king tide. And the drought, you know, Kiribati is a very small land, it's flowing on the water. But it is very useful and important to raise the security of the persons with disabilities to our government, so that they will cater and do work on how to protect persons with disabilities. Normally in 2020, and we have 2010, I think around that, and we have the support from the Pacific Disability Forum and the one from the USA to support us, to allow us to work on the advocating to the key ministries to address the needs of the protection to persons with disabilities in regarding to disaster situations or emergencies. What we did, we appoint our appointments to our key bodies from the government. Like one is the disaster management unit, where we sit with them to make sure there's a policy or there's a paper or their service should be available or should be addressing the needs of persons with disabilities. What we found out when we met the office in the first start, there's no proper plans for persons with disabilities. So we know that all the policy or the act that being used by by our government is all the same. What we are pushing, what we are raised to that time when we make a time to, and we raise that we need a special issues that can cater for our disabilities, the diversities of disabilities. And we know that there are a lot of gaps, so that we still know that we are left behind among the policies. By that time, we are very lucky, and we are very glad to tell that our key partners are very willing to support us and willing to head our issues in terms of what we are all this according to what we are raising to them for our needs in terms of disasters. We know that there's not a big disaster comes to Kiribati, but we just see some forms of the erosions, the allocation, but there's no dead or affected people that need help here. But what we raise to our government is trying to make sure that all their work, their service should be catered for our needs, and we are willing to tell them now we have included our race in the Disaster Management Unit Act, and the policy will go the KQ, the Kiribati implementation joint project, and you can.
To wrap up, please.
Okay. Okay, and I would like to thank all the CBM for allowing us to share our views with the disaster. Thank you.
Thank you, Teka. I'll just go back quickly to Rima to check if he is able to connect. Liz, Karen.
Hi, Setter, it's Liz speaking. Rima does look like he is unmuted, but we're still not hearing him. So it looks like there may be some technological problems for Rima to present today, unfortunately.
Okay. Okay, sorry, Rima. We will push on, and hopefully if you're able to connect towards the Q&A, we may have a point or two from you at that time. But our colleagues will move on. As part of our consultation project, we also work to capture the stories and perspectives of a number of persons with disabilities in the video recording. Our video includes interviews with people with disabilities from our region, Asia and the Pacific, who took part in the consultation and shared experience of disaster and preparedness. We will share that link to that video following this webinar. Another key aim of our project, our consultation project, is to hear directly from people with disabilities about the recommendations and priorities. So what needs to be done to make people with disabilities safer during disasters? It is now my pleasure to welcome all of my fellow steering committee members for this project. Virendra Pokral as coordinator of Abilis Foundation in Nepal. Virendra has a long history of disability activism in Nepal and elsewhere beyond, including our global work on disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. Virendra is a valuable member of the committee, State Committee for this consultation, and I'll be sharing some of the key issues, key points that people have persons with disabilities have identified as being needed to make sure included in DRR. Virendra, over to you. And
Thank you, Seda.
probably give you about 5 minutes also, if I may. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Seda. Yes, as a part of the consultation, people with disability were asked about their perspectives and what they think about the disaster risk reduction and their participation. It was encouraging that how people with disability are being participated, and it is also noteworthy that how people with disability are being deprived of the disaster preparedness plan and the overall disaster cycle. Within this, the early warning system, most of the concern was the early warning system. It is the very important aspect of disaster preparedness, as the visually impaired, they don't have the accessible notification, they don't have the accessible apps also, and for those having the sign language, using the sign language interpretation, they don't have the accessible early warning system. So as we noticed that many people with disability participated from very grassroots level and from the countryside also. And in this area, the technology, it is not reached again. So in the urban area also, the apps being developed is not fully accessible. That is a main concern of most of the participants. At the same time, the participation was one of the issue when the local government and the entity working in the disaster preparedness are not inviting people with disability and asking their concern for the overall disaster cycle. And this is also a very, very important aspect as CRPD clearly mentioned about the role of persons with disability and their representative organization in the overall process of the decision when that affects people with disability. And after the disaster, when the disaster is there, then the evacuation center we have seen in most of the cases is not fully accessible for people with disability when the support system is going down, and also the humanitarian aspect is not fully compliant with the need of people with disability. So this evacuation center should be fully accessible for people with disability, and they should have right to communicate by their own, use all the humanitarian support system freely and equally with the other people. And one very important aspect is the budget allocation for the disability preparedness and the accessibility standards, providing the humanitarian assistance. So the budget, the issue of the budget comes. The government don't spend budget for the accessibility aspects, and they don't focus on the concern of the people with disability. So that is one of the very, very important aspects raised in this consultation process. And most of the government has to pay due attention for this. And as we see CRPD, it also clearly mentioned about in its Article 32 about the international cooperation also when the development actors are working in the area of disability inclusion, and then the attention should be paid for the allocation of budget for the people with disability and the disability inclusive disaster preparedness plan. So these are very, very important points that has come up with this consultation process. So I think this will really help for the further policy development and the further research also. It will be embracing some of the key issues. So I just stop here. Thank you, Sarah. And if you have some, if the participants and colleagues, if you have some questions, then I'm here with you. Thank you so much. Yes, Sarah, is over to you now.
Thank you very much, Virendra. Great to have your input and your support the work of the steering committee. And our friends, colleagues, we were hoping that there will be some questions by now in the chat box, in the chat message, and we are now into question and answers time. And I thank also the speakers who have shared their views. Our two colleagues from Asia and from one from the Pacific. If you have a question, please feel free to unmute, turn on your camera, and ask your question. Do say your name and the organization and country before you speak. Otherwise, as I said, you can type your question in the chat box. I'll just check quickly with the list if there's any question on the chat box.
Hi, Setra, it's Liz speaking. No questions coming in yet on the chat box, so perhaps we could pose one to get the ball rolling.
Okay, while we get questions ready, come on, this is our webinar. Welcome questions to our speakers or on this subject. But to get the ball rolling, I would like to ask a friend from Teka, from Kiribati, Teto Matoa, for Teka. Teka, if you could, based on the recent the experience of recent disasters in Kiribati, what advice can you give to mainstream DRR actors to ensure that people with disabilities participate and benefit from disaster preparedness in DRR? Teka?
Yes, I will write in that text box. But
do you want me to repeat the question, Teka?
Sorry, yep. Can you repeat? Sorry.
Yes, if you, with the experience of recent disasters in Kiribati, if you can share with us this webinar, what advice, what will you tell the mainstream DRR actors, the Red Cross, the Action Aid, all those, on how they can include persons with disabilities to participate and benefit from DRR preparedness and the like? Your thoughts, please.
Yes, it's very clear. Thank you. Okay, what we have been telling our partners that we all patients should be involved in the decision making to promote the participation of the rep from TTM who can make to speak on behalf of patients with disabilities. And we are lucky to get that we are now part of the big disaster government committee that deals with this disaster, and we have the rep that needs to update and to see and to talk on behalf of the gaps that may be seen. I think that's one from that if it's clear from.
Thank you, Teka. Thank you, Teka. Please feel free to unmute your microphone and ask a question to any of the speakers, and do make sure that you also say your name, your country, and organization. Any hands up on the hand raised list, or any question in the chat box?
Hi, Seta. We have had a few questions come in on the chat box, and I can see that Rima is back online, but perhaps we could pose the question that Arti Patel in the chat box has asked to Rima, and to get him speaking on the overlap between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. RT says, so far, I think it's fair to say climate change policies and budgets have not really considered the rights and needs of persons with disabilities. Perhaps Rima, if your technology is working, would you have any comments to make about climate change and disaster risk reduction, particularly with recent Tonga experiences?
And I'm so glad to be back to do
I'm sorry, Rima, we've lost you again. Okay, that didn't go so well. Perhaps we could see if one of our other speakers would like to answer Artie's point around climate change and disaster risk reduction crossover. Professor Asha?
Yeah, I've been working on this issue for a number of years now, and we have been trying to include DRR in climate change because the cyclone that come have also promoted coastal erosion. 1/5 of our coast has disappeared. And so there's large displacement and migration. And this is linked to disasters also. That means both shelter and food insecurity, as land is lost, agriculture is lost, and it shows that by 2070, we will need 70% more food. So these are two things I think we should pay attention. And the third one is the urban DRR, which no one seems to be paying much attention to it.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Asha. Liz, can we take another question and then probably we'll move on?
Yeah, Seta, it's Liz here. We do have a hand up from a colleague on the line, Paul Dini.
Okay.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you, Seta and Liz, and lovely to see lots of familiar names and faces on the session. Look, it was a question to Caitlin. It's probably a deeper question just about how we have all the lessons from COVID-19 might be applicable to work and disaster risk reduction. In particular, I'm interested, Caitlin, in how DFAT is, the health section and people working in the COVID area and those working on humanitarian and disaster risk reductions might be working together, as there might be quite a lot of parallels in in disasters and in the COVID pandemic.
Thanks very much for the question. If you don't mind, I'll pass to my team who are dealing with the very specific implementation of our commitments. So, Kerry, if you're there, would you mind responding to this question, please?
Yes, Caitlin, Kerry T'other here. I'm just turning my camera on. It's a very, very good question. We are working closely with climate colleagues, particularly on the Women's Resilience to Disasters program that we have funded through UN Women in the Pacific, but also funded a global knowledge hub. So if you look up Women's Resilience for Disasters knowledge hub, there's a lot of gender information bringing together the gender equality sector and the disaster risk reduction sector. So much information available there on disaster risk reduction, particularly for gender, and some of those resources, not all, some of them relate to disability inclusion, looking at that intersectionality. As Caitlin mentioned at the Asia, thank you very much. My colleague Adelaide has put the link in the chat. As Caitlin mentioned, the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, to be held in September in Brisbane, has disability inclusion as one of the cross-cutting themes of the whole conference. As Kate, my other colleague, has put in the chat, the applications for expressions of interest are now open for organisations to nominate, maybe a group of organisations together to nominate a topic and an area of interest to share solutions and share challenges. And we and UNDRR would very much welcome organisations who can share knowledge and experience on disability inclusion in DRR, including on climate adaptation. Obviously in our region, before COVID, 80% of the disasters were climate related. So it's a big focus of all of our disaster risk reduction efforts. There was one example I'm aware of where we've taken DRR knowledge and directly applied it to COVID-19. And that is the Women's Weather Watch initiative in Fiji and Vanuatu through ActionAid and other partners, Shifting the Power Coalition, I believe, where there's a network of women who are connected via phones to share early warnings of imminent cyclones. That was the beginning of the initiative. And they've worked with those members, their members, to take the scientific advice from Bureau of Meteorology to say a cyclone may be coming at this level of warning, to work with members so they understand what steps, what early actions their communities need to take based on the weather warning. So translating that scientific advice and early warning to action, and having the distribution network and localizing that information so that local communities understand the warning. They've taken that model and applied it in Papua New Guinea to sharing information on COVID and COVID safe behaviours, COVID actions that can be taken. So I'll be very interested to hear the results of that scaling up of that model. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you for that. We are almost out of time, but I just want to plug in a quick question to you, Janatal. If you just share very briefly any inclusive community-based DRR program that has happened in your area, and what the benefit have you seen from those programs? Very briefly, please.
Yeah, we had opportunity while I was working with ADD, so to manage the urban disaster while during happening the flood. Well, we just try to provide the support for the slum dwellers who has the disability of physical disability, mostly the visually impaired. But specifically, there is actually, I can say that urban designers and the city corporation authorities, they need to be to have this inclusive planning, which is still now missing. But the NGOs and other supporters, even government authorities, they're providing the like relief and the, for instance, support to rescue them. Those are provided on that period, but the planning should be inclusive for future.
Thank you very much, Chantal, for sharing that experience. Friends or colleagues, if there are the questions that you've shared at the chat box that are not answered, do not worry, we will be responding to them in time to come, the next week or so, as we share with you also other documents related to this webinar. One of which also that we are not able to play today, that there is a key product that was created in this consultation process, is an animated video, again highlighting the importance of disability, inclusive disaster preparedness. That hopefully will also be shared with you along with the other video that I spoke about earlier. Well, friends and colleagues, you wonderful people that do this great work out there in the Asia Pacific region and beyond. As we close today's webinar, I want to thank each one of you, and particularly also to the Government of Australia, through DFAT, for commissioning this research consultation project, and to all of you for joining our webinar today. And on behalf of the project team, I want to thank each one of you to participate in the consultation and share your experiences to provide us this rich information that we are sharing today. The reports and the videos would not be possible without available input. And we hope that these reports and the videos would become useful resources as we advocate in time to come, particularly this year with these two big events coming up on disaster risk reduction, both the global platform and the Asia Pacific Ministerial later this year, opportunity to share experience and build understanding on these issues. So once again, on behalf of the organizers, the webinar, the CBM Advisory Team Global, CBM Australia, the International Disability Alliance, and of course here the Pacific Disability Forum, thank all of you participating, and onwards and upwards, disability inclusive DRR. Thank you, and God bless you all. Naka.